one of the things that we were talking about in the development of the program was the importance of understanding the unique role of governance in a cooperative organization. There are some unique needs in terms of understanding how you manage a democratic system of governance with one member, one vote, and how governance is often, in a lot of organizations such as the credit union sector, there are regulatory requirements around governance. When we look at the corporate sector, there are governance training for directors. And in co-ops, too often governance is, especially in agricultural co-ops, people find themselves on a board of a cooperative organization with governance responsibilities and legal responsibilities that are defined both by the Cooperatives Act, by their own bylaws, and very little training as to what their role in governance actually looks like. And so we often see that as an obstacle for cooperatives to thrive in understanding how governance, a robust governance system with engaged members can provide for a solid footing for an organization. And so I'll turn it over to you, Judy, and recognizing that most of our panelists today are remote, so they are joining us, and we'll see them on the screens. And Bill Umachin, who is playing double duty in both sessions. So there will be a little bit of, Judy is up here alone, but for the moment as we get going. Okay.
So thank you for joining this session. Our first step was to do introductions, and so hopefully Bill will be here any moment and join me on the stage. I will ask Warren, Shona, and Karen to introduce themselves and welcome on the screen to our session. Karen, do you want to go first? Tell us who you are and your connection to the co-op world of governance.
Sure, thank you. I'm transporting myself in from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and never surrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Eastern Canada. So I've traveled a long way to join this session today, and I'm glad to be part of it. In terms of my governance involvement and co-ops, well, currently one of the main hats I wear is as managing director of the International Center for Cooperative Management at St. Mary's University here in Nova Scotia. And we do quite a bit of work in the governance and the co-op enterprise space. Personally, I've been sitting on boards of directors for the past 20 years. The past 15 years have included cooperative boards. Currently, I'm one of the vice presidents of the board of Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada, which is probably familiar to many in the room, the cross-sector apex organization for cooperatives and mutuals here in Canada. I'm also finishing up 8 years on the board of a credit union. And I joined the board of a energy efficiency utility called Efficiency One last year. In terms of co-ops, I feel lucky enough to be steeped in co-op governance thinking of all types of co-ops, the membership types across different sectors, both in Canada and elsewhere. With the International Center, it's really giving me that exposure to the diversity of approaches to cooperative governance and the fact that it is very different depending on the context of the co-ops. So I like to think about it, write about it, discuss it with others, teach it, and also practice it. So that's my background, Judy.
Thank you so much. Shona, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shona McGlashan. I'm calling you from the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in Vancouver, BC. And I'm a chartered governance professional and a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Governance. So my professional expertise is, generally speaking, governance. I've been in the co-op sector for almost a decade now. For about 6 years, I led the governance function at what was then Mountain Equipment Co-op, and now work and then for the last 3 years, been leading the governance function at Vancity, which is Canada's largest credit union. Really focused on what makes great decision-making and specifically what makes great decision-making in cooperative organizations. I have a particular focus as well on equity, diversity, inclusion, and also workplace mental health. I lead the workplace mental health strategy at Van City as well as my governance work. And I'm also currently building a framework for anti-racist governance at Van City, which is very exciting and new work. I also, like Karen, I sat on not the board, but the nominating committee of Co-ops and Mutuals Canada. I also sit on the board of Bard on the Beach, which is a theatre company here in Vancouver, Pain BC, which is an organization dedicated to supporting people with chronic pain, and the Van City Community Foundation, which is a community foundation, hence the name. So love talking about governance, love talking about co-ops, very excited to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Shauna. Warren.
Thanks, Judy. My name is Warren Serafinchen. I am the President and Chief Executive Officer of BC Tree Fruits Cooperative. First of all, welcome to everyone and great to be here today. I've been in my role now for a little over 2 years, and in the first, I'd say the first year and a half was heavily focused on modernizing the governance of the cooperative. And it's made a significant and massive difference in how our organization is working. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you and asking or answering questions from the group. Before that, I've worked with companies such as Sunripe, again, based in Kelowna. I've worked with the Mars Company, Maple Leaf Foods, and Labatt Breweries, all in senior positions and some global positions. So thrilled to be here today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Judy.
Thank you, Warren. Bill.
Good morning, everyone. Bill Omakin, and I have what I consider a 360-degree perspective on cooperative governance. I have served on a number of boards of directors of cooperatives, including right now. I've been sued as a board director of cooperatives. I have prosecuted boards of directors of cooperatives and other types of corporations. And I've represented cooperative boards when they've been involved in litigation with either the government or with others. And so I feel like I have a very 360-degree perspective. As I said, I serve on a number of cooperative boards. Among a couple of the cooperatives, I serve on the board of the American Farm Credit System. And our 9-member board governs an organization with $380 billion in assets. And then I also serve on our healthcare cooperative board called Group Health Cooperative South Central Wisconsin, which is annually judged to be one of the top 5, if not the best healthcare provider. We employ our own doctors, own our own clinics, of about 380 systems in the United States. So we're very, very proud of that. And then I will note that your comparison position, I was the Deputy Commissioner of Agriculture, Minnesota. You'd call that the Deputy Minister. And I was the, what you would call the Minister of Consumer Protection for the state of Wisconsin. And in both positions, I was the regulator of cooperatives.
Wow, it sounds like we've got both countries fully covered in this cooperative governance and board member game. Wow.
And I should have mentioned, I'm licensed to practice law in both Canada and the United States and represent a number of cooperatives in the United States. And Warren, I think it's okay if I say that I've done a lot of work with BC Tree Fruits, for example. So
I was gonna mention that at some point, Bill. So no problem at all.
So let's talk about what is governance. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what governance actually means. Warren, do you want to take a stab at this topic?
Sure.
What's the framework around it?
So when I think about governance, I think about the structure in which an organization works. The rules, the guidelines, ultimately designed to facilitate business, but also in order to define how problems are solved, how disputes are resolved, and what have you. So having a modern set of guidelines for your organization is critical. And throughout the course of the morning, I'll talk about what can happen when you don't have a modern set of governance principles in place. But briefly, that would be what I see as governance in our cooperative.
Thank you, Warren. Bill, can you give us an example of a beautifully governed organization? What does it look like? How would we recognize it?
Well, I think Warren's organization, BC Tree Fruits, for example, has substantially improved its governance processes over the last 2 years. And this isn't to be critical of anything that happened before, but they went through a very recent review of their articles and bylaws. So their governing documents for the organization, a very close comparison with the BC Cooperatives Act to make sure that what's in the governing documents are very consistent. Warren's cooperative has a very robust set of policies. And those are policies that have been reviewed, in some cases, substantial changes over policies that were put in place earlier. A very robust nomination system for the board of directors to make sure that they can get the best qualified members of the cooperative who can step forward, be elected to the board of directors. Because BC Tree Fruits has a lot of opportunity, but it has a lot of challenges, and you need a board that's going to have the ability to effectively analyze, think about, and make decisions on those key issues. And not just to pick on BC Tree Fruits, because as I said, I think they've done quite well. There are a lot of examples of well-run cooperatives, and maybe a little bit later we'll be talking about cooperatives that aren't necessarily so well-run from a governance perspective, and why they are either the Titanic that's already hit the iceberg or on their way to hit that iceberg.
Great segue, because that's where we're going next. What is an organization with a challenged governance model look like? Karen?
Well, yeah, thanks for throwing me that one, Judy. I wasn't thinking so much
You're most welcome.
the challenge to go. Well, I guess I have to throw my answer kind of on its head, because when I think about cooperative governance, it's this system of democratic self-governance to help achieve the goals of the organization, which is supposed to be the goals of the members. So if I were to say what is one that isn't that, it would be all those, the opposite of all of those. So a cooperative, because again, if we're talking about cooperative governance, it's recognizing that there's a particular governance system that needs to be in place in co-ops. So if you look at your co-op and you say, I don't really see democracy happening, or I don't see us, we're not really clear on what our goals are, or that if those are the goals of our members as a community of people coming together collectively to do something that they need or aspire to need. And if the goal of the organization and the role of governance is to safeguard that and ensure it's relevant and it's resilient, and that's for past members, current members, and future members, it creates this really special need that I think is very hard to do, and that many co-ops perhaps struggle with, because you have to step back and make sure you're doing things in a certain way that are quite complex. So the democratic piece, the intergenerational asset, the on behalf of people, not capital centered. So I've turned your question around a little bit, Judy. You've been trying to paint the picture of if you're looking at your co-op and you can't identify those core elements, then you're probably in trouble.
So let's recap. The 4 elements are?
I'm not sure if I said 4, but I would say democratic. I said safeguarding an intergenerational, let's call it asset on behalf of members, something that's it's about people, it's members coming together collectively under this system to reach their goals, a collective set of goals for people, and the co-op's almost the delivery agent of that. Those are some of the things I said. You can make a list of those.
Additions, Shauna, Warren, Bill?
Yeah, if I can chime in on this one, I think there's a lot of kind of misapprehension about what good governance is or looks like, in the world at large. I think a lot of people, when they think about governance, they think about Robert's Rules of Order and policies and procedures and people moving and seconding motions. But I think if we can take a step back, what is the purpose of governance? The purpose of governance in any organization is good, strong, robust decision-making. And the purpose of governance specifically in cooperatives is not super different from that, but we know that cooperatives exist to serve a member need. So governance in co-op should be about making sure that the organization is defining and serving the member need and has channels to do that. So to me, the interesting and the fun things about governance are not the rules and the procedures. Absolutely, there's a foundational level of structure that you have to have. You have to make sure that everybody knows what you're talking about, what decisions are being made, who has the authority to make decisions. But you do not create the world's best decision-making by writing the world's best terms of reference. Those are table stakes, and you need to be reviewing them and updating them, which I think Warren has gone through recently. But they're not in and of themselves enough to create that magic, because what's also really important is, above, I would place above those kind of frameworks is information flows. How are your board and executive team communicating with each other, ensuring you have the same information? How are you communicating with members? How are members communicating with you? And then even more so, almost than information flows, is culture and tone at the top. What's the culture around your board table? How are you educating, orienting? How are you creating an inclusive leadership space where everybody's voice is heard? So I think a lot of people, when they think of governance, think of this kind of very dry and dusty, this isn't about me, this isn't like me, and I don't want to be involved in this. But actually, for me, really at its heart, it's about how do you run organizations? And since organizations are people, how do you get people working together to meet the need of the members of the co-op? So, good governance is lots and lots and lots of different things.
And if I could just build on something that Shauna said, oftentimes it is viewed as that dry part of how organizations work. My experience, though, if you structure your governance properly, what the end result will be better results, because not having good governance in place results in slow or poor decision making, infighting, unclear roles and responsibilities, and it goes on and on. So fundamentally, good governance results in better business results, which is ultimately what we're all here to deliver. So I'd really encourage people to get past the perceived dryness, I'll use that word, and really look at the benefits of how you can run your organization more effectively.
And I'll note, I agree with absolutely everything my three co-panelists have said. I have a slightly different perspective because typically I get called in when governance is very exciting. And what I mean by exciting is when there's significant problems. That's when the barristers and the solicitors get called in to provide assistance. And when you think about governance, cooperatives stand in a very good place compared to other types of corporations. And why do I say that? So I spent, as I said, 6 years as head of the Wisconsin's Consumer Protection Agency. We would get 200,000 complaints a year from Wisconsin consumers about businesses doing business in the state of Wisconsin. Because I had started in the cooperative system when I was 5 years old, that's my first memory of going to a cooperative annual meeting with my father, the electric cooperative annual meeting. I've always been very, very interested in cooperatives. I was eventually trained as a cooperative attorney in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so I said to my consumer protection staff, and I had about 250 staff, I said, I want you to go into our database and pull out every single complaint we have against a cooperative. And again, remember, I have this other statistic, 200,000 complaints a year. Guess how many complaints I found against cooperatives annually? And I examined this. Actually, I've now examined it over about a 15-year period. Fewer than 10 each year. Even though in Wisconsin, the cooperative system, we're the second leading cooperative state in the nation, Minnesota's #1, despite the fact that billions of dollars of gross annual product is created by cooperatives, fewer than 10 a year. So that said, that cooperatives operate very, very differently from their corporate brethren. And I said I prosecuted a few cooperatives. I prosecuted way more corporations that were not cooperatives. And what cooperatives really need to do, what you all need to think about, is this term called the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule is the same whether you're in Canada or south of the border. The courts in both countries treat it very, very similarly. And I also should point out the cooperative laws at the provincial level are very similar to the cooperative laws at the state level. What the business judgment rule says is, as long as you as a board of directors are operating in a reasonable fashion, in a way that corporate or cooperative directors are expected to operate, then the court's not going to second guess your decision. They're going to give you the benefit of the doubt, even if you make the wrong decision. So how do you get that benefit of the business judgment rule? You've heard these terms before, and this is where we get into the dry area, the duty of care, the duty of loyalty. I'm sure most of you have heard those terms before, if not all of you. That sounds a little dry. Those are show up at board meetings, be actively involved, ask questions of management, the term I use, trust but verify management. Make sure you don't give out confidential information. Don't try to self-deal against the cooperative by trying to get business from cooperative. If you do all of those things as a cooperative board director, you're going to get the advantage of the business judgment rule. And in my view, that's really the holy grail then of cooperative governance. And that's not to exclude everything else has been said, but that's the legal perspective. If the government comes knocking on your door, it's because you failed under the business judgment rule perspective.
So you've given us some concepts here about a well-run cooperative. So let's say that, you know, this half of the room is a governance board for a cooperative, and this half of the room is another cooperative. How would they know that things are off track? What does it look like? Who wants to start with that one? Warren, thank you.
I have a little bit of experience with this. What I found was when I'm going to say a board and the management team or executive team of a company are not working in concert. What I've seen is lack of trust, slowness in decision making, analysis paralysis. Again, decisions just not happening. And in our particular case, we had a number of years where there were some important decisions that could have or should have been made that didn't happen. That we're working our way through now, and with our new structure, we will get through. But all of those things were symptomatic, and you could see over time the business results were trending down. So usually it most likely starts very innocently, but it creeps in and gets bigger and becomes more problematic. And again, over time, when the business isn't positioning itself for growth or a new competitive environment, those lack of decisions can become extremely problematic. So that's been my experience. Is look at your results. It could be membership levels. It could be, again, profitability. It could be retention. It could be a lot of different things. But that's what I've seen most often.
And I think also, less dramatically, you can have invisible governance challenges that are really an opportunity cost, right? Because when governance is working really well, that relationship that Warren speaks to, the relationship between the board and the executive, will be used to kind of accelerate decision making, to test, to kick the tires of ideas, to provide alternative viewpoints, to make good business decisions. If you don't have that for whatever reason, and it might be personal conflict, and it might be slowness, or lack of qualifications, or lack of diversity on the board, or whatever, the opportunity cost, I think, is that your co-op is not benefiting from all those great things that the board can do. Now, your co-op might very well still perform adequately or well, but you're just losing the benefit of the kind of accelerator that great governance can provide, which may not always, what happens around the board table, for very many good reasons, is often highly confidential. So sometimes it might be quite hard to figure out as a member of the co-op.
So that one of the greatest traits of the human race is the tool of denial. Who is it, and how does a co-op say, hold everything, we call uncle, we're in trouble? What happens, and who brings that message to the table without being shot at?
I'll take the first shot at that, because that's usually when I get called in, is when somebody has rung the alarm bell. And that can be members who decide to move forward a special member resolution. Whether you're in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, there's a procedure under the Provincial Cooperatives Act to do that. And that sometimes is the first notice to the board of directors that there's a significant portion of the membership who may not be happy with the way the cooperative is proceeding. Other times when I've been called in is when you don't have alignment between board and management, and either the board or the management will call me in to do mediation between the two, or when you don't have alignment within the board of directors. And that is also a pretty common situation where you have factions on the board and they're fighting. And as Warren said, they can't make decisions effectively then. You've got that overlay, as Warren also talked about. Usually there's declining financial performance is going on, usually declining quality of products and services that is also being provided to the members. So there's lots of different people, stakeholders in a cooperative. And so that notice can come from any direction. And it's the board of directors that's slow to respond. And we all know through lots of personality testing, you can either agree with it or disagree with it. There's a pretty significant portion of the population that doesn't like change. And so if they get challenged by change, their way of responding is by slowing down. There's a smaller proportion of the population, if they're challenged by change, they'll actually try to rise to it. And as a lawyer, what I would tell you is we have what's known as malpractice, that if we've got a problem with the client, we need to take care of it right away, because if we don't, it usually gets worse. And like I said, when I get called in is when the board of directors and management, in some cases, has failed to act. And then I get brought in because it's already a pretty big problem.
So how often do you see somebody's heads rolled, or the AGM happens and the chair is now voted off the island, or the termination of the general manager has happened? Are those warning signs as well that there's governance challenges?
Again, I can offer a quick comment. In my particular case, I was the 5th CEO in 5 years. And we all know that that's clearly not best practice. And all of that instability was absolutely a sign that there was a lack of alignment between the board and the CEO. There was distrust between memberships and the membership board management. We had this web that was problematic. Thankfully, as we've worked through our governance process and really taken a more strategic view of the business, in my particular case, I'm now it'll be 3 years in September, and I've got another 4.5 years on my contract. So that stability will help us execute a plan, but it provides some consistency in leadership versus a turnstile in the CEO role, which is just not a good thing to see happen.
Karen, what have you seen?
Well, I'm just thinking, because a lot of how we're framing this is the assumption that there's the board and there's management. And I'm just thinking in my head around this idea of when we get into situations and we're in trouble and we look at our structures and we say, well, actually control is in the hands of very few people, whether that's in this case CEO and just a board of directors. And in a member organization like cooperatives, if they have a very large membership, I always look at that and say, well, where are all the other voices? Where are all the other opportunities to be part of these conversations, to engage directly? Because when the fire alarm goes off, that may be when all the other member heads pop up. But if we structure our cooperative more as a system within our co-ops and make sure that we have more opportunities for more members to be part of the system as it is evolving and growing, I guess I see that as important. And so that there isn't this sense of a lack of transparency or a lack of disclosure when it is already too late. So I point to systems, and I don't know, Warren, at your co-op if you have this or whatnot, but in a number of agricultural producer co-ops, it is more common to see delegate structures or to see other structures within the system that allow more members to be engaged, more members to be part of strategic conversations through the year, not just at that one time when very few maybe want to show up at the AGM or the election, like trying to think of ways that you have more of that buy-in and hopefully more of a diversity of thought as well that's going into how your organization can progress. So I'm just trying to go back to your question too, Judy, just around when do you know you're off track? Well, it's much easier not to get off track if you have more people involved and more members, but then also needing to add that layer of diversity of thought because we don't always have that within our membership. So then what are we putting on our boards or bringing in as other viewpoints? And there's many ways to do that. But that was just one of the sort of countermeasures to control in the hands of few. And is that the best design, especially in very complex, evolving, competitive industries? And especially when this is all about the members and that collective group, it's not about the capital ownership. That's not the model, right? It's members that are owners, and so they're people. So engaging more people in more of the places in a system. And I wish that I felt all co-ops were doing as much as they could to build those different mechanisms in, because I do think that strengthens the governance system, the engagement, commitment, and trust in the organization of a broader group of members.
And I would agree with Karen. I think this speaks a bit to the information flows I was referring to earlier. At board of directors in any organization, quite naturally, the majority of the information you get about the organization will come from the management of the organization. But it absolutely cannot be the only way that the board is getting information about the organization. There have got to be mechanisms for members to directly communicate with the board, for systemic issues to unveil themselves, for whistleblower hotlines, for communicate, understanding what's going on in your sector and your industry and so on. I think, as Karen said, AGMs and elections are actually like a pretty poor test of member engagement. AGMs are pretty niche activity. And I say this as somebody who loves AGMs and goes to a lot of them. But I think we have to accept that for most co-op members, AGMs are not a lot of fun. And so there's multiple ways that you can engage with your members. For very large co-ops and maybe co-ops that are quite distant from their members' lives in some ways, you can get a lot of data and analytics about what your members and what how your members are behaving and what they want. In smaller co-ops, the primary means of engagement might be more personalized, but how do you create that range of ways to collect information to find out how your members are feeling and how they can communicate? That is not just limited to like, oh, well, this is the number of members that showed up to our AGM, because that's probably not a good test. And also members tend to show up to AGMs either if there's really good food or if something is going wrong, or both. So, it's not necessarily a good test of governance at all.
So let's say that we're looking at our co-op board and we come to the realization that they're not reflective of the members from gender, culture, geography, whatever. What do we do? And does the board need to be a good representation of the membership to be an inclusive, functioning, well-governed organization? Bill?
I'll start off. Absolutely. And because one of the dangers, I'm getting my PhD at the University of Saskatchewan right now, and we had managerial decision making as one of our doctoral level classes. And one of the things we talked about is the danger of groupthink in a boardroom. And groupthink can happen much more easily when we all come from the same backgrounds, the same perspectives. And so the danger of groupthink is we don't adequately test the initiatives being brought forward by management or by our board leadership. And so one of the best ways, and there's a lot of research that's been done on this, the more diverse your boardroom is, generally speaking, the better your decision-making process is going to be. And that diversity can be from a cultural, ethnic, political in some cases, depending on what type of cooperative you're in, and so on and so forth, but to bring a lot more voices to that table that are more reflective of that membership. And I said I serve on our healthcare cooperative board, and about 1/3 of our members are ethnically diverse in the Madison, Wisconsin area. And we weren't getting the kind of engagement that we really wanted to get. So what we started to do was to build leadership opportunities for individuals who came from a more diverse background. Didn't put them on the board of directors right away, but put them on a member advisory committee. That meant monthly we provided meals, a small level of compensation, provided some education and training so that we could get them to a level where they could then functionally perform the role as a member of board of directors of a $500 million cooperative organization. And some of our credit unions have built the clubs. Well, actually, we put a number of credit unions in high schools and have boards within that high school. And our high school population in the United States tends to be more diverse than the general general population. The younger and younger you get, you're more ethnically diverse. And so you get high schoolers and others brought into the cooperative system. We're an unusual state. This is a slight sidetrack on that, but Judy's heard this before. Wisconsin, before you can be a teacher in our public school system, the teacher must take a class in cooperatives, and all school children in our public school system must have curriculum in cooperatives. And so it's a very robust kind of cooperative education that all of our public school kids across the state of Wisconsin. So that really allows us then to bring cooperatives into our school system, whether it's a school store, school credit union, whatever. But that's where we really start trying to develop that future talent. They may not be on the board for 20 years, but they may be on the board in 10 years, depending on what their leadership trajectory is. But what we've really tried to do is think as broadly as possible. And Shona, as she mentioned, being responsible for diversity at Van City. And I know Van City's got a lot of different initiatives to do that as well. And I know that Karen and Warren can bring up their own perspectives on this. But I think there's a lot of examples out there. It'd probably benefit us to collect those examples and share them as potential best practices.
Yeah, I mean, I would go, I totally agree, but I would go harder on that, because I don't think, diversity and inclusion on the board table is no longer a nice to have. It's absolutely imperative. And this isn't just about making good business decisions. I think that non-diverse bodies do not have decision-making legitimacy, frankly. We've all seen, the pictures of the male US politicians deciding on women's reproductive rights. It's not okay. If your board is not diverse, it is, no matter how well-intentioned, your board is going to make decisions that inadvertently harm marginalized groups. It's absolutely necessary for governance. It's 2022. If you tell me that you can't find qualified diverse candidates for your board that bring diversity of thought and background and cultural identity and sexuality and gender identity and so on, I'm here to tell you are not looking hard enough. Because people are out there, brilliant people are out there. We don't need to wait 25 years. This is something we should have done 25 years ago. And there's lots of ways that you can build that in. But I would say, take a good hard look. If your board's not diverse, I think it's not a legitimate decision-making body.
Karen, thoughts about solving this challenge? And I'm going to jump to the conclusion that this is still a challenge.
Well, I agree with Shona. I'm glad she used such strong words to express that. I mean, it's a challenge, but who's keeping it a challenge? Who's standing in the way of progress? And, sometimes it is the board that may be sitting around the table that doesn't want to step aside or doesn't want to make space or may have their own serious blind spots. Like, there are ways to get through this, but it is a bit of the recognition of the challenge and getting through it. And of course, in cooperatives, sometimes we might look and say, well, look at our membership. It's actually not a diverse membership. But part of the challenge with I'm saying challenge a lot here, but cooperatives, many of our cooperatives are single member types, right? But that doesn't mean we don't have other strategic stakeholders that aren't represented in that membership. So with producer co-ops, well, we're often mostly focusing our attention on the producers, they're the members. Flip it and think if you're a worker co-op, well, you're thinking through the worker piece and they're your members, or the consumer, including credit unions. And then we have multi-stakeholder co-ops. I think that if cooperatives could spend more time imagining, what if I were a multi-stakeholder co-op and all of us actually have multiple strategic stakeholders? So think through our governance systems a bit like that, because if all of those stakeholder perspectives would be legitimate if you're a multi-stakeholder co-op, which maybe you won't go that far, but just play the game of pretending you are, then those would be who would need to be represented and have voice or within your governance systems. And that might be another way to unpack who could be part of your governance structures. I'm saying it could be board, it could be delegate structures, it could be other committees and the various other ways. But that may help people to get over the hurdle of thinking, well, if they're not in my membership, then, how would I get them around the board table? Well, that doesn't need to be where you stop. And we know there are many boards now these days that have found ways to have external directors, if it's a formal board structure, or it was still within membership, but a credit union example in the United States, OAS Federal Credit Union, where all of their board committees, and they have a number of them, actually have one board member on them, and the rest are all populated with other members that aren't part of the board per se, but it's a bit of their their way to then develop leadership. So they actually have 60 members engaged in these various governance committees. So there's I think, Bill, you said it, like we need to document maybe more of these, but there are many ways to do this. And it's the fact that we need to assume the way we're doing it now isn't the only way. And that's why we can look around the world and we can find lots of examples of the diversity of practice to just do better.
Sorry, if I can just jump in really quickly. This speaks again to my point of almost all boards have diversity policies. And yet, if we look at the world of boards, corporate boards, and we are nowhere near reaching a diverse or equal, in Canadian publicly listed companies, right now in 2022, there are something like 8 Indigenous directors and 9 people who identify as having a disability. I mean, it's absolutely scandalous. And so all the policies have not translated into action of appointing, more widely to boards. So what's going on? We need to fix it.
The only I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I'd have 2 other builds. One is having a very robust nominations process that in and of itself has diversity. So one of the changes that we made, this is a recommendation from Bill and John Kay from Realize Strategies, is we've got 6 people on our nominations committee, 2 board members, 2 people for management, and we've got 2 growers who in our case are top quartile or high level growers. Getting that diversity in the nominations process, I think that in and of itself broadens the scope. But Karen mentioned independent directors, and one of the other major changes that we made is we've got a board of 10, and we've got 2 independent directors, which is the maximum that we can put on under the Cooperative Act. And again, that just brings diversity in thinking beyond the traditional co-op, and we're seeing great value in having 2. And I say I think I use the word independent. I meant external directors, but having those different points of view is very valuable because it's easy to get into routines, and somebody coming in without the history, the knowledge, the politics, coming in and asking some of the really tough questions is invaluable. So I would just add those 2 points.
Thank you. So let's say that we've been talking about the board structure. What about the management and the staff structure? What if those individuals are not reflective of our diverse membership? What's the foundation we build and make that change? Or is there a change required?
Well, I think clearly everything that I think applies to boards also applies to organizational leadership and the organization itself. And I think, with the kind of global movements of things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the recovery of the bodies of the children in residential schools, I think many people who have not been thinking or not been very exposed to systemic inequality and systemic racism in our society are learning more about this. And I think a lot of organizations are taking steps to tackle the systemic inequalities that they maybe are creating or sustaining. There's so much good work being done here. Not enough, not fast enough, but absolutely organizations need to be looking at their inclusion policies, their diversity work, the diversity of their staff, how they're creating inclusive spaces, healthy spaces, psychologically healthy spaces for people. And there's lots of resources out there that organizations can do. But yes, if an organization, if a board, if a leadership team is looking around and saying, we're not reflective of the population that we serve and are part of, that is a big problem. That is a big challenge. And they need to take steps to address that.
Yeah, and I would just know, I 100% agree with that. What applies to the board applies to management, applies to staff. The challenge we have in the United States, you have it somewhat lesser in Canada, is there's a strong pushback in the United States against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's within cooperatives, that's within the broader society. For example, I stand in 2 weeks for a re-election to the board as president of our local school board, Madison, Wisconsin. I have an opponent who's been heavily criticized of my initiatives as board president, lead the board into diversity, equity, inclusion. She believes that's wrong. She may very well defeat me in that election. The United States is about equally divided on that issue right now. And you all follow American politics because you're next door to the gorilla. And so that makes it a difficult context within a boardroom and within the membership, because sometimes the board and the membership are going to also reflect those divisions. And that's why it's really, really important to have a robust diversity, equity, inclusion program, but you also have to be careful about the way you do that, because you may get a pushback that's not only going to stop what you're trying to do, but may go well beyond that as well. And I just bring that up as a cautionary tale. And because I think most of us in the cooperative system believe strongly in diversity, equity, inclusion, but we have many individuals out there who don't believe in that. And I would also just a quick side note too is, as cooperatives, I'm going to be a little critical of us, because we're very good at knowing what we do, the products and services we provide, but we don't often talk about why we're cooperatives. What's the philosophy about why were we needed back 10 years ago, 100 years ago, and why are we still needed? And how do we take that knowledge, that information, and make sure it's throughout our organization? Because I've gone into many credit unions, for example, because I'm very close to the credit union community. And I'm not talking about Van City in this case, but if you ask staff members, do they know that they're in a cooperative? Nearly 100% will say they have absolutely no idea they're in a cooperative and why they're different from a regular bank. They know there's a different logo and a little bit different marketing, but they don't really understand that. And I think that's really important to getting more diverse in your cooperatives, that go back to the cooperative philosophy and talk about why you exist in the first place. And I think a lot of cooperatives have really forgotten that. And as a result, we don't see that translation down through the generations. And that's why we're lacking in many cases that younger leadership that is more reflective of our community as they move into those leadership roles. Just my opinion.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in on what you're saying, Bill, somewhat, because I think one of the opportunities for cooperatives is to get outside of their one cooperative box.
Yep.
And what we are good at as a cooperative movement or sector is being a system and a network. And at least from my experience being in this sector for 15, 16 years, is why I'm in it is partly that I exposed myself to it beyond the one cooperative board that I was a part of at that time. I believe that if I had continued just sitting around a board table, I would have perhaps thought that I understood cooperatives, but it would be a very narrow view based on what I saw happening and what the practices and behaviors of that one co-op was. Instead, by joining, and I know not give a plug for conferences like this, but provincial associations, all of a sudden you're part of something that's cross-sectoral. You're rubbing shoulders with people in very different sectors of the economy and society, very different makeups of membership, and hopefully that makes people curious and trying to understand, like, oh, why is my co-op like this, and why is one that's actually perhaps in the same sector but looks very different, and just starts to open people's minds, and maybe is a way to get over that hurdle of being entrenched in thinking that, oh, we can't change, and I look around my community and things have always been done this way. At least from my experience, getting involved locally, nationally, internationally, just seeing what's out there and what's possible, building relationships also leads to building knowledge. And I would really love to see all cooperative boards and management teams really pushing for the importance of that. And I know we're going to get to that more in terms of how do people continue to build their knowledge. And I do think that there's something very important about Principle 6, cooperation among co-ops, and the associated bits that include federations and associations, and how we learn and we work together.
Thank you for that, Karen. So we've talked about the capacity building of co-ops. Bill, you've talked about leadership and starting young. We've talked about training. Where and how do we build that capacity within an organization to function at a high level of governance? What are the other options? Where do we look? And how do we identify what's needed within each individual cooperative? Jump in, any of you.
Oh, sorry, Warren, did you want to go ahead?
No, please, Shauna.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to this. I think it will be very contextually dependent on your co-op and your board members and so on. I would say, time spent on director education is never wasted. And I think, a great board that has the capacity should be looking at education, both at a holistic level, like what does the whole board need to learn and what do individual directors need to learn? There's so many great resources around here. There's attending conferences like this. There's courses that are by and large designed for corporate governance directors. They can be a bit frustrating sometimes coming in as a co-op governor, but they will contain lots of practices that are also useful and relevant in co-op governance. The University of Saskatchewan does an online course on co-op governance. Funnily enough, COVID in some ways is one of the silver linings, is it's given us a bit more of an opportunity to take educational opportunities that wouldn't have been available to us before. So I would say, think broadly and widely about ensuring there's education for your entire board, as well as helping individual directors identify what they need to learn.
I was just going to make a comment and a build to what Shona just said. What you need on a board is going to ebb and flow over time. And one of the things that we've done is we've identified what skills we think we need on the board. And there's some that are very standard and are just the price of admission, and you need to have these things. But then we get into specific levels and specific skills that we think we need to execute our strategy right now. To give you an example, we're in the process of completing a lot of real estate transactions, building facilities and what have you. So we have someone with extensive real estate experience on our board. There's a lot of work we're doing on the financial side. We've got a CPA on our board as an example. So it's going to ebb and flow over time. But I totally agree with the comment about making investments in director education. Not something we've done a lot of in the cooperative in the past, at our cooperative, but is something that we're planning on doing. And in fact, in the month of May, we've got 4 directors attending one of the ICD courses, and it's around governing with courage. So it is not a wasted investment, and it's a really critical investment to make in your organization, because ultimately enhancing the skills of directors is only going to make your cooperative more successful.
And given I'm at an educational institution, I should probably chime in on the education question. Yes, as Shona mentioned, there are many centers across Canada. Canada's probably, I think, one of the richest countries in terms of the expertise on cooperatives within educational institutions of higher education. And University of Saskatchewan, our center at St. Mary's, Syracuse at the University of Sherbrooke, and the list goes on, University of Winnipeg. There is expertise and there are programs. So one of the things we do is an online part-time master's program. That was really the foundational piece that started the center. And it's for people working in cooperatives. And I've just developed a new course on governance and participation, and it's running right now. And so I'm sort of in the middle of it. There's 45 students from 45 different cooperatives and different experiences from Canada, the US, the UK, and maybe a few other spots. And so you just imagine the diversity of different examples of governance and what people are learning. And even when I poll people, what's your background in governance? That's really where to start, because I don't assume everyone's starting at zero. Many of these people have 20 plus years of experience working in cooperatives. And it's also amazing what people come in with and then what they leave with, what they learn. That's one example, as well as, the short courses. I did do the ICD program myself, but a decade ago. And I do agree that there's value in those corporate programs, but there's danger if people doing them don't know how to translate that for co-ops. And Shona, you kind of alluded to that. And so that is where we need to make sure we have added in that cooperative competence, We're helping people to translate, because the worst thing for a co-op is to come in with the inappropriate view and filter for a cooperative that isn't a fit for a cooperative, and that can maybe undo all of the good work the cooperative's trying to do. But yes, lots of educational, experiential opportunities out there in Canada, and there is an understood need. I think the sector understands there's a need. Also pointing out, and again, to call it, it's not just what those might be doing, offering in institutes. Like also Shona is very involved in the Governance Professionals of Canada, and it was a few years ago that there was sort of a co-op specific day that started. Those I think have been great. And provincial associations. I mean, there's a lot being done, and provincial associations to offer education. Back again to what Shona said, it's not a one size fits all, and it's figuring out what you need, but continuing to invest in it and probably understanding it's out there. And then last point, being back to principle 6 in cooperation among co-ops. There's some very large co-ops in Canada that have invested a lot internally to develop really good governance programming. And typically those types of co-ops are quite excited if others are interested in it. And so there's ability to share across co-ops to pick up on some of the very robust programming that exists. I mean, in the agricultural space, not to pick one, but one that I know has invested a lot would be Gay Lee in Ontario in terms of their director training. And the Scottish Organization of Agricultural Societies in Scotland has immense director training programming. So some of that might be part of the solution too, to just build on the backs of other work that's been done by others. Not a quick fix, but there's definitely a potential.
And I'm going to tell a story that's going to bring in Judy, ACCA, St. Mary's, and United Kingdom. So about 12 years ago, Judy, I think it was, I joined Judy and other ACCA board members and other groups involved in ACCA on a trip to the United Kingdom. And we were over there at the time that their largest cooperative, the Cooperative Group United Kingdom, essentially collapsed. And what happened is that they lost a lot of money. They'd gone through a tremendous expansion. It just so happened that I had lectured out at the University of St. Mary's at a master's program, and a number of the young people involved in that were executives or have become executives. In fact, some of them are now the highest executives of the Cooperative Group UK, and I continue to text and email them on a weekly, if not a daily basis. And they brought me in to, whoops, sorry about that, to do an analysis.
There's one of them phoning you now.
Yeah, no, it's Beloit, Wisconsin. But sorry about that. But what we found and when Parliament did its review of the Cooperative Group UK, and we happened to be there at the time that Parliament was doing its review, is they found that nobody on the board of directors in either their current term or their previous 2 terms had gone to any cooperative board director education. None whatsoever. So what was the parliamentary response to that is we can't trust members to be on the board of these large cooperatives that are really important because they sold about 10% of the groceries, over half the travel bookings. I forget exactly the number of bank deposits, 90% of the funerals. The cooperative was very integrated in fact, we sat with a member of the House of Lords who started to cry because of the importance of this cooperative had been to his family, and he was afraid they're going to lose it. And so the Parliament said, we got to have an all expert board of directors. We don't care if they use the products or services of cooperative, would have totally defeated the fundamental idea of a cooperative. The reason why I got brought in, because I had a different perspective, because I'd prosecuted some of the largest corporations in the United States who had all expert boards of directors, people who had been the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and on and on and on, and they didn't perform any better. And I said, the missing element is the education. You've got to educate board directors, and it just shouldn't be in the boardroom where management's deciding who that expert is going to come in and track the board. They need to go outside and talk to other board directors, learn best practices. And I serve on several boards that have a board budget every year for education. In Farm Credit, we budget $16,000 a year just for my education as a Farm Credit board director. And that's pretty rich for a lot of organizations. We're, again, $380 billion institution, but we invest so kinds of dollars because it's really important not only to us, our members, but also to our regulator to ensure that we're properly educated as board directors. So if you don't do a budget for your board at the beginning of the year for education, I highly recommend you include dollars in your budget for education.
And if you can't get the learner to the education, bring the education to the learner. So let's open up for questions. from the floor and from our participants online. Questions for our panelists? Thank you.
Thank you. It's been such a fascinating conversation, especially around cooperatives that are large. And you know, we talked earlier on about the disconnect maybe from between members and boards. And I'm wondering if you can provide some advice for smaller cooperatives that are maybe, because, you know, we're looking at food hubs that have maybe 20 or less members. Some of the issues and challenges that can arise in a small cooperative. Are there any pieces of advice that you can give to that size of a cooperative?
Who would like to take that?
Now, what's the start?
Well, I could give a few just immediate practical thoughts.
Perfect.
Not to ever think you're alone. Like there are so many people to just call and reach out to. I mean, I think my door is pretty open. I always welcome random, you know, questions and those on the panel and in the room to figure out what is it that you need help with. And if it's access to education, I think in the cooperative sector, there's a lot of very inexpensive or free or subsidized opportunities for people to be educated if that's what they needed, supported, coached, connected with other organizations like your own. I mean, I missed the sessions earlier, just caught the tail end on food hubs. But as an example, I'm linked to a consulting co-op here in Nova Scotia that's quite new. And one of the projects they're just starting is around a food hub. And I thought, okay, so I need to figure out what all came up in this session, because that's going to be a complete new exploration. And they're going to have some of those same struggles as other new small organizations. And even in my course, one of the questions a student who's in the US asked was sort of along the same lines. Like she wants to do a deep dive analysis of she called it a micro co-op. So you're saying maybe 20 members. In her case, like 3 to 5. So there are these scales of challenges with different size co-ops. And I think one of the pieces that's unique in our cooperative system is that, at least in my experience, it's the most open and generous network of people and organizations that are really there to support each other. So it sounds a bit cliche, but you know, ask for the help that you need, figure out what help it is that you need, and lean on others to expect them to help you get there.
Excellent.
The only build I would put on that would be, even as a smaller organization, smaller cooperative, don't overlook the importance of having, I'll call it the appropriate level of governance, and maybe you call it governance light, but don't say governance close to zero, because eventually you may grow, or you may want to make investments, or you may have significant decisions that you need to make, and having that underpinning is going to be important. So, you know, I've talked to a number of lawyers about societies and smaller co-ops, and I've just heard some of the stories around some basic things like not maintaining member lists, and you know, just things at a fundamental level that you need to have in place that smaller organizations tend to overlook. So that would be my perspective.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And there are a lot of resources out there, and perhaps we just have to connect the smaller cooperatives better to those resources in the universities, in ACCA and BCCA. There's a rich group of resources just within your trade association here in British Columbia. And so and the fact that you're here helps show that you're connecting in already. I don't know if you're specifically in a smaller cooperative, but this is a great place to be. And it's glad we can get together in person now to do this.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm a manager of a small cooperative who's really interesting listening to you folks talk today, and some insights into what it's going to be like maybe when we grow up. We're small and very youthful. We're like 8 years old. And something I didn't hear you talk about, and I'm curious about, in our development, probably the biggest challenge we have is competing interests at the table. And I mean, you get together, I guess it's obvious to everybody here, you get together because you're trying to cooperate. And yet what I see is the challenge of differing interests. They want to cooperate on those things that are good for them, but not necessarily on those things that aren't good for them. So for me, the strongest tool I've had in our growth was a strong set of value principles going in. And, when we started out, it was just a shopping list of these things. But over time, I've sort of been able to boil it down to a small handful that we keep repeating and revisiting. And that's what's held us together and got us through conflicts. And so I'm curious, you guys never mentioned it. Do they become embedded in your institutional thinking of your grown-up cooperatives, or do you sometimes go back and revisit your value statements and reinforce that? I'm kind of curious about what it's like to be all grown up.
Shona?
I think there's maybe two questions there, and one is about dealing with conflicts of interest. Maybe I don't know if you wanted to pursue that, and certainly we can. But in terms of kind of re-looking at the organizational purpose and so on, I think you do have to. Your organization, no matter how big, no matter how much it grows, has to remain relevant to your members. Otherwise, what is really the point of it? And so, Van City, for example, will look at its. So Van City, for example, over the last couple of years, we've made changes in things like our climate commitments and how we're heading towards net zero and so on, and in different ways in which we make sure that we're kind of what we call ourselves a financial force for change. So yeah, I don't personally think it's setting an organization's vision and values as a one and done. I think that you will keep looking at it. You'll keep testing your relevancy and keep deciding what it is that you collectively want to achieve. I think there's a mindset of some people feel that there's some kind of founding fathers and what they wrote down has to be, continues to be the font of all wisdom, and that's just not my mindset personally. So I do think you would want to revisit it.
And there's a tension there. As you're in a smaller cooperative, your members of the board of directors tend to feel a lot closer to the products and services they're expecting from your cooperative than if you're in a large cooperative, because as the board director of a large cooperative, you just view yourself as being part of the masses. And it seems like a little bit, even though you're getting the same products and services, it appears to be more of a or less direct kind of relationship. And because of that tension, then my observation, it's anecdotal, but I've got 35 years of experience representing cooperatives, you tend to see the conflicts of interest more in the smaller cooperatives than you do in the larger cooperatives as a result of that, because people are just more sensitive in the larger cooperatives that I can't just be looking out for my interests. I got to be looking out for the interests of all the members. And I don't mean to say that large co-op directors are any better than larger or smaller cooperative directors, but there's just kind of that innate tension that just seems to be there. And so I've always said to small cooperatives, you're a small cooperative, but you still need to have a robust set of conflict of interest and ethics rules. And we need to do training on that just to make sure everybody's clear about that. And usually once you've done that, then people have it in their brain like, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I got to understand, or I understand I've got a fiduciary duty to all of our members and I can't be quite so self-centered.
And you can build on those values that you worked hard to define. And I'm a great believer that because I'm a facilitator, I'm a project manager, and I'm an educator. And I don't know if you know this, but 80% of us are visual learners. So we have to see things to conceptualize and to absorb. My suggestion for every organization, I don't care what your legal structure is, those values need to be on the top of every meeting agenda. And as decisions are made, if you're not following the values in the decision-making process, it gives you the quick point to come back and say, wait a minute, let's review these values. So you keep them in mind all the time and allow the membership and the board to absorb those values as a core foundation of the organization. So goals and values, top of every agenda. Keep that North Star that we're shooting for always in sight. Other questions? Yes, go.
Hi, I just want to reinforce the values piece. Our worker co-op is teeny tiny, 5, And so we found exactly what you just said. We pulled out the co-op principles and we put them on top of every agenda in a light way. And then annually we do an actual review, and we spend several hours talking about how are these showing up for us? Where do we need to do better? And what does that look like for the year ahead? The second thing was training and consensus decision-making was absolutely critical. And we are process geeks, and we still needed to have a formal training, and we got the symbols and we kept those in front of us, and we very intentionally practiced working through that process. And the third thing was around different competing interests. Twice now we've actually brought in outside folks to support us, where we couldn't all be in the conversation, and also helping to hold the conversation and facilitate it in a respectful way. And that's been so helpful to us, both in learning about how to communicate about those different interests, but also helping us resolve them.
Good strategies. Okay, let's move to some closure or go around the room. We'll start with you, Bill. Points of wisdom.
Points of wisdom. It's not as hard as it seems. And that I keep telling cooperatives that it's not as difficult as you think it might be to properly govern a cooperative, but follow best practices to the extent you can identify those best practices as robustly as possible. Remember, in the end, you're there because of your members, because your members want products and services. We have the benefit of the fact, unlike the rest of the corporate world, our capital is patient capital. Our members hope we're still here 20 or 30 years from now. We don't have stockholders who are wondering what our profit's going to look like in the next quarterly report to our regulators. And finally, remember, there are resources out there, and I found in the cooperative community in particular, a lot of those resources are free. And you don't necessarily have to pay for them where you might have to in the outside world, and just look through them. And BCCA is a great place to begin, and ask BCCA, hey, we've got this issue. Do you have a sense of where we could find resources? Also the universities, certainly St. Mary's, I got to put in the plug for the University of Saskatchewan Center for Cooperatives, but there's plenty of resources out there if you just know to ask questions.
Thank you. Warren.
I would say, as I opened with, don't underestimate the importance of governance and the impact it'll have on your financial results, but also get the assistance that you need to make sure you've got the right structure in place. Because sometimes that objective, third-party, nonpartisan view of how things are working today and what improvements could be made can be very sobering for a board and for management. That's something we did in our case. Again, we used Bill and John Kay from Realized Strategies. They had no interest in our cooperative other than to make it better. And they provided some very constructive feedback, some very direct feedback, but ultimately it was designed to make us better. So make those investments, because there is a payoff.
Good point. Very good point. Shona.
I'm going to share with you all a quote from one of my favorite writers, Ursula Le Guin, which is about love, but I think it also applies to governance. It's love doesn't just sit there like a stone, like bread. It has to be baked new every day. And good governance is not a destination that you get to and stay at. You have to remake it, rebuild it, review it. But so think of it as a journey that you're on, and enjoy the journey, because when values aligned people get together to make an organization really sing, it's great fun. It should be fun. You should be enjoying it. And to echo what both Bill and Karen have said, like, ask for help. There's lots of people out there that you can just call and ask for shared experiences, wisdom, shoulders to cry on. So enjoy the ride.
Thank you. Karen.
I feel like everyone that spoke before me said great things that I agree with. what would I finish with? Well, the last person that asked the question, we don't see the audience, so that you see us, we don't see you, but the one with the worker co-op and having the values or principles on the wall, I was immediately I jumped to, okay, and let's make sure we place this in the context that makes sense to us. So sometimes it might feel disconnected when we will hopefully know there's a statement on cooperative identity, the definition and a set of values and a set of principles, but how do you make that your own? Make it make sense in your context with the language that makes sense to you. And so with the worker co-op example, I immediately thought, well, make sure you look at Mondragon. Why do they have 10 principles? So when we say P6, cooperation among co-ops, well, for them, that's P7, and it's called intercooperation, and they've added others that are more specific to labor. And so based on the context and the type of cooperative you are, create the system that makes sense in your context. I agree with what others said in terms of the importance of that with governance and your management structures and the form and function of your memberships. And lastly, I'd just say, my 2 words of why I'm still doing what I do and why I love being part of the co-op sector is that you will never get tired or be done in building your knowledge or your network. So that's it.
Thank you very much. So I'll just leave you with a parting quote. Challenges are what make life interesting, and overcoming them is what makes life meaningful. Thank you. Thank you for your questions, your participation, and thank you for sharing your experiences and your knowledge and your wisdom with us today. It's been a real pleasure working with you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. That was really such an informative panel. I think that often when people see governance on the agenda, there's always that question of it's not the exciting and sexy topic, and yet it really is the foundation on which organizations can thrive and also engage the membership in a way and empower the membership to be able to have that role at the table and really have ownership of the organization. So thank you for that. We're transitioning now into lunch, and opening lunch. We have our guest, the Minister of Agriculture, Lana Popham, joining us. And I wanted to, in reflecting on introducing the minister, I wanted to think about the last few years and say, I don't think a lot of people run for public office hoping that they're going to be in charge during a pandemic. We have a ministry that I think in many ways is very lean, like the number of staff and the responsibility they handle. And yet there's an energy right now in the Ministry of Agriculture amongst the innovation. We see this with the food hubs, for example, like what's going on. And this ability to adapt a project to the different unique aspects of communities around the province. We have such a spread out province in these thin valleys of fertile land where we can grow food, and these really isolated communities in a lot of ways, the difficulty of moving around. And I know that the minister has stated that when you're the Minister of Agriculture, your office is the whole province, or your portfolio is the whole province, and the ability to get around and talk to people is crucial. At the onset of the pandemic 2 years ago, there was an outreach that happened across the sector. And it wasn't a few phone calls. It wasn't a few hundred phone calls. It was thousands of points of contact that ministry staff had with people in the sector. And then meetings that were set up online with the minister and all of the staff that were responsible for working with each different commodity group across the province. It was astonishing, the amount of work that happened. When I can speak from my own experience, like in Abbotsford, in November, having a minister on the ground who knows the names of the producers, who is able to phone them and ask them, what are you facing? What's going on? To bring her colleagues in to address what's happening. And having said that, I was reminded this morning of Simona Caselli's comment yesterday of how do you do good governance? It's you choose your best and you hold them accountable as though they're the worst. And I think that is the That is the dynamic that anyone in politics has to deal with. And our minister has done it very gracefully, balancing the interests of the well-being of her staff in the ministry, the well-being of the people on the ground producing food, the consumers hoping and looking for a secure food supply chain. And so as we come together in this first in-person conference following 2 years of being apart, it really means a lot to have the minister here to share her thoughts with us this afternoon. And as we reconvene, we have people coming in from the symposium. I'd like to turn it over. Minister Popham, thank you for being here this afternoon.